I tend to consider myself one of those people who are blessed, lucky, however you want to phrase it, because I get to do what I love doing for a living. I'm incredibly grateful for that because I know that there are a sizable amount of people who don't get that sort of opportunity. They can't make a living at what they love, or they never really figured out what it is they loved, so they had to make a living elsewhere. So being able to do what I love is truly a great blessing for me. And I'm proud to say, I guess is the way I'll phrase that come this December, it'll mark 18 years since I was ordained to be a minister. Meaning that I have finally reached a stage of my life where people are starting to take me seriously. I have fooled them all. But there was a moment in my life where I genuinely felt like all of this was at risk and not of my own decision making. In July of 2013, I was fired from the church that I was serving there at the time. I had been there for 2.5 years, and while it had not been the smoothest 2.5 years of my life, I still found myself blindsided by that decision that was made. I've worked in some capacity for a paycheck since I was 14 years old. And since that time, I have had a wide spread of different jobs. I've worked in food service, I've worked in IT, I've worked in customer service, I've worked in, a couple other places that I'm forgetting. I was a warehouse worker for a little while. That was unique. And certainly, I've worked in ministry. And in all that time, I had never been fired from a position before. I had always left because I had found something better for myself. I always left on good terms. Everything was great. There's still some people that I think if I called them today, they would probably hire me for a job because they think that highly of me. And so to find myself fired was a complete gut punch for me. And frankly, from a personal standpoint, it could not have happened at a worst possible time. Because that previous October, Mandy and I had welcomed twin girls, and I was the only source of income in the house. And so that was going to hurt us in a financial standpoint, but to be completely honest with you, that's not really where I was focused on at that time. See, like a lot of people, men particularly, though certainly women can do this as well, a sizable chunk of how I identified myself was wrapped up in my job. I kind of made the core of my identity that I was a minister, that I was somebody who worked within the church. At that time I was working with students, and I kind of viewed that as the core of who I was. And so in that moment when I was fired, suddenly that identity felt disrupted. I had this irrational voice in the back of my head for months afterwards saying, what if a church never hires you again? Who are you then? Notice it said who, not what. Because so much of my identity was wrapped up into this notion that I am a minister by choice. And maybe that's why I've reached a point in my life where I don't love it when people call me Pastor Brandon or Minister Brandon, or when my brother's trying to get my goat, he'll call me the Most High and Holy Reverend Brandon. Nobody gets under your skin like your little brother, do they? But that was kind of the core of who I was. And so to have that disrupted, and more importantly, to have that voice screaming in the back of my head, what if? I didn't just lose a job, I lost who I was. I didn't know who I was in that month that followed afterwards, and trying to figure out what are the next steps for me and what is going to happen to my family and all those other things. I had so much of my identity wrapped up in this, and I've realized eventually that the place where I had put my identity was really someplace it never should have been to begin with. Because that place, the place that I had made the foundation, the core of who I was, well, it's never really a stable one, is it? Right now in our culture, the discussion of identity seems to be the focus of almost every conversation that we have. Or at least it feels that way. I mean, really, I would tell you that the issue of our identity is something that is a constant thing in our lives. We wrestle with it. It's one of our first big questions of who am I? And we will continue to wrestle with that until they're throwing dirt on us at some point in time. Each and every one of us wrestles with that question of who am I over and over and over again, because it shifts and it changes as we age and as things happen in our lives and as events take place. But it seems like right now, and I think it's really because of social media that the conversation of our identity has become so public. We are now able to have that conversation with more than just our inner circle. We're able to have that conversation really with the world at large. And so many people will pull their identity from all kinds of different places. It could be their career, like mine was. It could be they could have their identity wrapped up in their marriage or the relationship that they're in right now. They could have their identity wrapped up in their children. They could have their identity wrapped up in their gender identity, whatever that is. They could have their identity wrapped up in their sexual orientation. They could have their identity wrapped up in fill in the blank here. But if you notice something about that list, they all share one thing in common, and that is that the situations regarding those particular things that they wrap up their identity in can change almost overnight. And when that happens, that's why so many times when things take place in our lives that are outside of our control, it doesn't just affect us in the moment, it affects us at a deeper level because we have placed our identity in those things. So when you lose your job, who are you when you're not working? If the marriage dissolves, who are you when you're not married to that person? If your finances somehow change, whether it be, heaven forbid, somebody gets your banking information and steals everything from you. Those Nigerian princes, man. Who are you in that moment? If it's wrapped up in your kids, who are you when they grow up and move out of the house? It's why when we face those shifts that take place that so many people suddenly experience an identity crisis. And the reality is if we don't want to experience an identity crisis in those shifting moments, then we have to really make our identity foundation into something that is more, stable. Right? Any builder will tell you if the foundation is no good, it doesn't matter what all the cool features the house has. Right? When Mandy and I were first looking for houses, and I was just reminded of this week, we were looking at this one particular house, I remember, and it was gorgeous. And we were first-time home buyers. This should not be in our price range whatsoever. It was 4 bedrooms, 2.5 baths. It was 2 stories with a basement. It had all these things going on to it. We went and looked at the house. It had 2 separate detached garages. One had a mother-in-law suite on it. Right? And I thought, this is great. We can put your mom out there. But we were looking at this house, and everything had been completely renovated. The bathrooms were new. The flooring was new all throughout it. There's a couple funky things in it, but it's an older house. One of the bathrooms was right next to the dining room, which... okay. But we looked at this house, and we thought, this is fantastic. Why is this on the market, and why is it in our price range? And then we went to the basement. And it was being held together by about 50 temporary posts, all holding the floor joists for the entire house. We looked at the foundation, and we saw black mold, and there was a couple spots where we saw daylight in the foundation. And we thought, now we know why. Let's get out of here before it falls down on us. It doesn't matter if everything else is nice about your life. If your foundation is rooted in something that it should not be, it can collapse at a moment's notice. Right? And so we have to ask the question of what should be the foundation of our lives. And so if we've reached the answer to last week's big question, the question of who do I say Jesus is, if we've reached the conclusion in a place that I hope that maybe you were reaching in your own life, that Jesus is exactly who he claimed to be, that he is and always has been and always will be God, then it stands to reason that we should ask the second of our big questions. Not who do I say Jesus is, but who does Jesus say that I am? Because if we believe that he is God, if we believe that he was not insane, that he was not a liar, then we have to assume that since he is God, he has created everything, ourselves included. And so he would probably know better than we could ever know for ourselves who we truly are at the core, what our identity root should be in, what the foundation of that identity ought to be. And the thing about it is that Jesus even told us that he and his teachings were a foundation that were worthy of our trust. In Matthew chapter 7, verses 24 through 27, he said, "Everyone then who hears these words of mine and does them will be like a wise man who built his house on the rock. The rains fell, the flood came, and the wind blew and beat on that house, but it did not fall, because it had been founded on the rock. Yet everyone who hears these words of mine and does not do them will be like a foolish man who built his house on the sand. And the rain fell, and the floods came, and the wind blew and beat against the house, and it fell, and great was the fall of it." If we want to have a solid foundation of what our identity is in, Jesus tells us himself that if it's found in me and in the teachings that I have given you, then you're on a solid rock, right? But everything else that we could possibly place our identity in is shifting sand because, again, it can all change at a moment's notice. So if Jesus is God, if we believe that that is his identity, then ultimately the best foundation for us to be able to place our identity in is in him. And so we need to ask the question, who does Jesus say that I am? And the beautiful thing about Jesus, the thing that I love most about him, is that he was very clear about who we should be and who our identity is and where we're finding our root in it. Don't you just love it when Jesus is like that? Right? Like you have a question and Jesus himself is like, well, here's the answer. There you go. On your way. I love it. I love it when they're simple things. And throughout the entirety of the Gospels, we can find different places where Jesus either hints at or directly points at where our identity ought to be found. And as we're going to see as we discuss some of the things that Jesus says that we are, unlike so many of the other things that we try to put our identity in, these foundations are significantly more stable and more permanent than anything else that we possibly could. One of the first things that Jesus says that you are is that you are a beloved child of God. I want to pause for just a second here and call a time out because right now, and I can tell from the room here, that there are several of you in here who are trying to stifle an eye roll right there. Right? You have heard the phrase, I am a child of God, probably most of your life, whether you're in the church, out of the church, whether this is your millionth time being in a church building or whether this is your very first time, you've at least heard the notion that you are a child of God almost to the point that it has become cliched, right? Can we be honest about that, right? So when Brandon said you're a beloved child of God, there were some of you going, oh, okay, come on, get to the real stuff. But let me ask you this. Have you ever really considered what this means? Right? Over and over again throughout my life, I have been told that you may think you know what love is, and then you have a child and you find out what it really is. I had someone tell me at one point in time that they viewed their children as being huge chunks of their very heart that are out freely walking around the world. And I don't know as a dad if I could possibly come up with a better definition of that than that. Of what it means of how I view my children, right? My daughters are on a very short list where there is absolutely no question if it comes down between my life or theirs, I'm taking that bullet every time. No problem. Right? And that makes it even more frustrating when they throw sass at me and all I hear is my own voice. Right? If they are, in fact, large chunks of my own heart, that means that they've also gotten qualities of myself that I don't love. And so when I see that on display, I know exactly where they get that from. I try to throw the blame to Mandy. It never works. Because I remember what I was like at 13. And even though I was a boy and they're girls, they sound an awful lot like 13-year-old Brandon. And I didn't realize just how annoying that kid really was. Adrian's in the nursery. I don't know if she can hear me or not, but that's okay. Anyway, But I love my children wholeheartedly. There is nothing about them that you could take everything else in my life. You can take my house, you can take my possessions, you can take my comic book collection. As long as I got my daughters, I'm good. I'm not going to think about it at all. All right, maybe I'd be a little bit bothered by the comic book collection, but only because I've been collecting longer than they've been alive. You get my point, at least. That is how I view my children, as they are worth everything else in my life. And Jesus says that is how God views us. That we are so precious to him that we are worth any and all sacrifice. Jesus actually illustrates the idea of how God views us in one of, if not the most famous parable that he gave us, the parable of the prodigal son. If you're unfamiliar, in Luke chapter 15, Jesus tells a story of a son who wanted his inheritance from his father prematurely. Basically, he says, "Dad, I wish it was like you were dead. Can I have my money, please?" Great kid. He then takes that money and he goes into the city and he does what young people with fresh money do. He spends it all on partying and drinking and wild living and making all the mistakes that every person in your life has told you, don't make that mistake. And before he realizes it, he has completely spent all of the money. What took his father decades to accumulate, he has spent in a very short period of time in his life. And it's all gone. And worst of all, he loses all of it in the midst of a famine. And so finding work is going to be that much harder. Somehow he's able to land a job and eke out just enough of a living to keep surviving. But that job is feeding pigs. And if you know about that culture, that time period, and specifically that religious practice, that's maybe the most disgusting, degrading job that they could possibly come up with. Right? Pigs are considered unclean. To touch one means that you have to separate yourself from the rest of society for a period of time. And now his job, his livelihood depends on his ability to make sure that those pigs are fed. And so one day he has this realization of, you know what, I don't deserve to be called my father's son anymore, but maybe I can still go home and he can hire me on because I know that he treats his servants better than I'm being treated here. He even practices a little speech that we see at the end of verse 18 into 19 of Luke 15, saying, "Father, I have sinned against heaven and before you. I am no longer worthy to be called your son. Treat me as one of your hired servants." And you get the impression that as he is walking towards home, he is practicing that speech over and over again, recognizing, I no longer deserve. I told my dad, I wish you were dead. I don't deserve to be called your son anymore. Could you just hire me on? But little does he know is that every day since he has left, the father had been eagerly looking out on the horizon, hoping to see the familiar frame of his son coming towards him. And so the one day when the day comes that he sees his son on the way home, look at how Jesus describes the father's reaction in verses 20 through 24. "And he arose, came to his father, but while he was still a long way off, his father saw him and felt compassion. He ran and embraced him and kissed him. And the son said to him, 'Father, I have sinned against heaven and before you. I'm no longer worthy to be called your son.' But the father said to his servants, 'Bring quickly the best robe, put it on him, and put a ring on his hand and shoes on his feet. And bring the fattened calf and kill it, and let us celebrate and eat. For this son of mine was dead and is alive again. He was lost and is found.' And they began to celebrate." See, the father didn't worry about the way that his son looked. He didn't concern himself with the poor choices that his son had made. He didn't even worry about the money that the kid had lost. None of that mattered because he had his son back. And that kid who just said, "Just call me your servant," his father didn't even let him get to that part of it because he was never a servant. He was always his son. Nothing could possibly change that. And that is how Jesus describes us as beloved children of God. This is such an incredibly beautiful foundation for us to place our identity in. And one of the biggest reasons that it is beautiful is because there is nothing we can do to earn that title. We just have it. I can't think of any way that my children could ever earn the title Daughter of Brandon. It's a weird title anyway. And I, for the life of me, cannot possibly, they've made decisions that I disagree with. They've made choices that I don't like. They've said things to me that have hurt me deeply. But I still, for the life of me, can't come up with a way that they could lose the title Daughter of Brandon. I may not love the decisions that they make in the future. Let's be honest. They're kids. They're going to make their own choices. And I've made choices that my mom and dad did not like. Moving to Ohio was one of them. Right? But they're never going to lose that title because that's who they are. We've tried to tell them already, it's like you're going to have times in your life where you're going to wonder, can I go home? The answer is always yes. Because you're our children. And we love you and we care for you. Jesus tells us that God views us as his beloved children because that is a foundation that cannot be changed. But Jesus in his grace tells us that we are still more than that even. Because he tells us that we are set free from our past mistakes. Every single one of us in here makes mistakes, right? I've made at least 3 today that I can remember. Right? Mandy tried to wake me up on time. I did not do that. That's one. I'm not going to tell you the other 2. Don't worry about it. Now you're going to worry about it all day. But each and every one of us makes mistakes. That's part of being human, is that we make mistakes. We hopefully learn from them. But some of us in this room have made mistakes that are pretty darn big, right? We've made choices that have changed the ways that we have viewed ourselves even. Now, a lot of times we try to justify this sort of thing by saying, well, yeah, the decision that I made was bad, but at least it's not. And we'll compare ourselves to other people. But make no mistake, we still made a mistake, right? In the church and in Scripture, we refer to this as sin. If you did not know, the word sin is actually a term in archery. It means to miss the designated mark, right? And God is the one who gave us the initial mark. He is the one who said, this is the standard. And when we fail to live up to that standard, then we have sinned. We have missed the mark entirely. Some of us have missed it close. Some of us have missed it to where we're not even shooting at the right target, right? I've been there. We're good. It's not just you, I promise. We all recognize that we have made mistakes, that we have all sinned. And while we may try to justify it, but at least it's not as bad as, it's still missing the mark, right? In archery, the score is still tallied the same, whether it was close or not close. And so when we talk about this notion of mistakes that we have made, we can see all throughout Scripture. In Romans chapter 3, verse 23, it says, for all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God. The first part of James chapter 3, verse 2 tells us, for we all stumble in many ways. So again, we all make those mistakes, but many of us in here, we sometimes simply wallow in those mistakes. Feeling the guilt and the weight of shame for the past mistakes that we have made over and over again, sometimes even to the point that we identify ourselves by our mistakes. Or if we don't, sometimes the people around us do. That when they see us, all they see is that terrible moment in our lives. But Jesus tells us that we are more than our mistakes, and that we can be set free from them through him. See, Jesus didn't just love and welcome people who were well known for their mistakes. He sought them out intentionally. Right? Jesus was often seen in the company of different people who were well known for their mistakes. Everybody in town knew what they did, and that's how they identified him. Imagine your entire life being completely defined by the people around you because of one stupid choice you made when you were 18, 19 years old. I don't know about you, but at 18 and 19, Brandon wasn't exactly the smartest guy in the room. At 38, Brandon's probably, or 39, see, already. Brandon's probably not the smartest guy in the room. Right? But that one mistake or that one moment or those series of mistakes became what they were identified by. So much so to the point that they were ostracized, kicked out of places, unwelcomed in others, whispered about, laughed at, even sometimes straight up shunned by the people around them because of their mistakes. So imagine the breath of fresh air it must have been to not only have a person, but to have a rabbi, a teacher, a spiritual leader, not just tolerate you being around them, not just welcoming you being around them, but them coming directly to you saying, hey man, I got to hang out with you. Nobody else in their life is saying that. And so to have this guy who is highly respected in the culture around him because of what he does, that has to change everything, doesn't it? Jesus did this so often that he actually developed a reputation that he himself would reference in Matthew 11, verses 19, saying, the Son of Man came eating and drinking, and they say, look at him, a glutton and a drunkard, a friend of tax collectors and sinners. And yet wisdom is justified by her deeds. See, it wasn't just that Jesus would befriend these people who were known for their mistakes. He completely transformed their lives. They were one person before they met Jesus. They were somebody else entirely when Jesus entered their lives. One of the most despised groups of people in this time period were tax collectors, right? So much so that they got their own special label, right? That verse we referenced before says tax collectors and sinners. If you remember your history, this is under Roman rule. Rome owns the world. And Rome, if you were not Roman, was not exactly a friendly boss. Right? They would hold their power by taxing people into poverty, levying huge, weighty taxes upon them. However, Rome can't spread themselves so thin to go and collect those taxes, so they actually hired out people from the towns that they were tax collecting in. Meaning that in Israel, that it was oftentimes Jewish people who were the ones collecting taxes, taking money from you and giving it to the perceived enemy. And it was fairly common practice that they took a little extra on top just for themselves. So not only are they traitors to your entire nation, they're thieves as well. So tax collectors were just a step above bottom feeders. And that was maybe a half a step at best. You'd rather save the dog than save a choking tax collector. So imagine everyone's surprise when we get to Matthew chapter 9, verse 9, in this one particular moment when this happens. It says, as Jesus passed on from there, he saw a man called Matthew sitting at a tax booth. And he said to him, follow me. And he rose and followed him. Jesus didn't just ask this dude to come over here and just follow him for a day. Maybe he just wanted to tell Matthew something. It wasn't anything like that. When Jesus said the phrase, follow me, this was a common invitation among Jewish rabbis and teachers to come and be my disciple. To not just come with me for the moment, but to spend your life with me. That you're going to learn from me, that I'm going to pour into you, that we are going to develop a relationship together, that one day you are going to go and emulate my teachings. A tax collector? When Jesus invites a tax collector to come and be his disciple, it is not just something that is shocking, it is downright scandalous. Because this man is a traitor and a thief. You cannot trust him, and yet Jesus is trusting him with everything. The thing about it is, History does not remember Matthew as a tax collector. Instead, we remember him as a disciple of Jesus. His entire life was completely and utterly transformed because Jesus showed Matthew he was more than his mistakes, but he did not leave him in those mistakes. The reason Jesus attracted so many sinners and tax collectors of his day is really quite simple. It's because he was the only person who showed them they could possibly be more. Even the other religious leaders of that time period didn't want anything to do with those people. If you were seen as a known sinner or tax collector in your town coming into the synagogues, then you were sometimes politely, sometimes not so politely, asked to leave. And yet Jesus saw them as so much more. And when he sees you and I, he sees the same. That we are more than the mistakes that we've made in our past. More than that, that we can be set free of them. That we can let that weight go. Even so far to the point that through his cross and through his death, Jesus provided a way for us to let it go. In probably the most recognized verse in all of Scripture, Jesus shows us exactly what that means. In John 3:16 and 17, for God so loved the world that he gave his only son. Remember, no sacrifice is too great for a beloved child. That whoever believes in him should not perish, but have eternal life. For God did not send his son into the world to condemn the world. And I always like to, in my mind, put parentheses right there, even though the world deserves it. But in order that the world might be saved through him. See, through Jesus, we are made more than our mistakes and our sin. We don't need to carry that weight anymore, let alone be identified by it. Not only are we beloved children, not only are we more than our mistakes and our sin, Jesus also tells us we are his friends. And again, I know this is another one of those like, tell me something I didn't know already moments for us. But again, think about what this means. I view friendship as one of the most unique relationships that we can have in our human experience. Some of you have heard me describe it this way, as friendship is essentially just us looking at one individual person going, yep, I'm going to hang out with that one, and then we do that. Right? What are we doing when we do that? We're making a choice to be associated with that person. Family you can't choose, right? You are born into the family that you have. That's your family whether you like it or not. But friends we get to choose. We get to choose to sacrifice some of our precious little time on earth to spend with them. We get to choose to have meals with them. We get to choose to spend whatever amount of life that we want to spend with this person. And we can always make the choice that I don't want to anymore. And Jesus tells us that we are his friends. And he doesn't do this because we've chosen this. Instead, he does this because he has chosen to be our friends. He's letting us know that we are chosen by him. What could possibly be more meaningful than that? Because Jesus tells us what it means to be his friend in John chapter 15, verses 12 through 17, saying, this is my commandment, that you love one another as I have loved you. Greater love has no one than this, that someone lay down his life for his friends. You are my friends, if you do what I command you. No longer do I call you servants, for the servant does not know what his master is doing, but I have called you friends. For all that I have heard from my Father, I have made known to you. I love verse 16. If you're one of those people who like underlines or highlights your Bibles, highlight verse 16 for Pete's sake. You did not choose me, but I chose you and appointed you that you should go and bear fruit and that your fruit should abide, so that whatever you ask the Father in my name, he may give it to you. These things I command you so that you will love one another. We did not choose him. He chose us. As a friend of Jesus, we can serve out of love, not out of force. Right? If I want to do something for my friend, I don't do it out of a sense of obligation. I do it because I care about them. If Beef called me today and said, dude, I need you. I can't tell you what's going on. You're going to have to just drive the 2 hours to get over here to me. I'm not going to go, I feel like I have to because he's come to visit me before. No questions. I'm in the car. Let's go. Because I love him. I care about him. I'm going to serve him out of the love that I have for him. We become more like him, not out of oppression, but out of devotion to our friend. To be a friend of Jesus means that we are aligned with the one who has known us and has shown us his love by laying down his life for us. What greater friend could we possibly ask for? And so when we set the foundation of our identity in who Jesus says that we are, and we are no longer tossed like sand on the shore. Right? If you go to the beach today and you go to that sand that's close to the shoreline, that's going to be different sand tomorrow. Because it's going to get pulled in, pulled out, over and over and over again. And when we place our identity in the things outside of Jesus, that is what our life is going to be like. Constantly shifting, constantly changing, never secured. We're going to go from one identity crisis to another until we're in the ground. That is a terrible way to live. But when we set our identity in who he says that we are, then we are setting it in the most stable thing imaginable, because the Bible tells us over and over again that he is the same yesterday, today, and forever. It does not change. It does not shift. And so when we face those times in our lives where suddenly our career is in jeopardy, it's not great, but it's not the worst thing that could happen. When we face those moments where the relationships in our lives are becoming more tenuous, I don't love it, but I'm going to be okay. Why? Because we have peace in where our foundation of our identity is found, because it does not change. If Jesus is who he says he is, then who he says that we are not only should matter, it may be the only thing that matters. Because if our identity is rooted in him, then it doesn't matter what's going on around us. We know who we are. It won't change tomorrow. It won't change the next day. It won't change 20 years from now. Because we are a beloved child of God. We are more than our mistakes. And we are a friend of Jesus himself. So let me ask you this. Who are you?